Okay, I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's talk by philosophy professor Ann O'Byrne, who will be speaking on democratic violence and the genocide continuum. This is the first in the series of talks by this year's HISB Faculty Fellows. And I urge you all to check the Humanities Institute website to see the other exciting talks that are coming up by faculty fellows and by others. I also want to remind everyone that application for next year's faculty fellows are now being accepted until October 19th. Again, you can find all the information for that and the application form on the website. Okay, and I am now delighted to turn the Zoom screen over to my dear colleague, Shirley Lim, who Zoom finally has allowed to speak. Shirley, as you probably know, is from the history department. And she will be introducing Professor Byrne, but just let me say a few words about Shirley. You probably know that she has published 2 books. A Feeling of Belonging, Asian American Women's Public Culture was published in 2006 by NYU Press. And her second book, Anna May Wong, Performing the Modern, was just published in 2019 by Temple University Press. And that book has led to multiple radio interviews and a spot in a documentary about Anna May Wong. So I am happy to introduce our own superstar, Shirley Lim, to introduce today's talk.
Susan, what a lovely introduction. Thank you so much for that. But let's now turn to today's main event, which is Ann O'Byrne's lecture. So I even have a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can get this up. Okay, so. There we go. Can you all see this? I guess I can't hear you since everybody's muted. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ann O'Byrne, who I'm sure most of you know. So Ann will be speaking on democratic violence and the genocide continuum. Ann is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy and received a PhD in philosophy from Vanderbilt University. So, and actually you can sort of see the technological differences. And I got this from the Indiana University Press website and hit download, and you can see that they're not quite prepared for our digital age in the way we would like it to. Oh, there we go. Yay. Okay. So, oh no, what just happened? Help. There. Hopefully this will stay. So Ann's monograph, oh my goodness. Okay, I think I may just, anyway, leave it this way, is Natality and Finitude from Indiana University Press, published in 2010. Ann's latest work is an edited volume called The Logics of Genocide, The Structures of Violence and the Contemporary World, and this is co-edited with Martin Schuster. And it was just released over the summer 2020 by Routledge. And you can see that Routledge in 2020 is much more prepared to deal with this digital age by having a very nice, stable image for me to show of the book cover. So I'd like to share with all of you some of Ann's article titles, which will give you a sense of the range of her corpus. One article is entitled Lessons from Anarchist Eugenics. Another is entitled Amory Arendt and the Future of the World from the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy. Another title is Communitas and the Problem of Women. And in the excellently titled Carnal hermeneutics, umbilicus, toward a hermeneutics of generational difference. In addition, Anne has given an invited lecture at the University of Aarhus in Denmark entitled, "Why Do We Abhor Genocidal Violence?" Has been the co-coordinator of the Hannah Arendt Circle and the director of the Collegium Phenomenologicum in the Città di Castello, Italy. Anne's lecture today, Democratic Violence in the Genocide Continuum, is timely, with deep implications for today's most pressing political issues. Genocide and indigenous murder in North America, the genocide of African Americans and BIPOCs through numerous forms of violence, including police violence, incarceration, and poverty. So her careful unpacking and tracing of genocide and democracy is really, it couldn't be a more timely topic given today's political events. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anne O'Byrne to the Humanities Institute. Yeah, there we go. I'll stop sharing the screen.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shirley, Susan. Thank you all for being here. This, I think, is really supererogation. It's a time when we've all spent more time than we ever wanted to on Zoom. And so the fact that you're willing to sit in front of your computer screens for an hour on a Wednesday afternoon is something I'm really grateful for. The political implications of this work are things that are going to have to get worked out in a way that tries to meet the contemporary moment right where it is. Another way of saying that is that what I want to do in this talk is to set out some conceptual structures and then hope that you will do all of that political work in the 20 minutes or half an hour that we'll have left at the end. So I'm very grateful to the Humanities Institute for the scholarship, the fellowship time that I had there, and it really did the job. It released a bit of teaching pressure to give me just the space that I needed to finish the complete manuscript of the book, which I'm redrafting right now. And what I'll do today is I want to lay out two strands of thought. So one that mobilizes a strand of thinking in radical democratic theory that thinks about the paradoxes of democracy. I'll state that quite briefly. And then on the other, consider the evolution that thinking about genocide has gone through over the past, well, 75 years at this point. And then I'll bring them together again quite briefly and see if that gives us a way of thinking about genocide differently and a gesture then towards what it might mean for our thinking about democracy. So genocide, instead of being an event of monstrous violence that happened over there or back then, genocidal violence becomes something that is at work in the quotidian operations of state violence, and not least in democratic states. So there are two terms that I rely on a lot in the work. One is genus or genos, from the Greek, referring to a group that is connected across generations. But I want to use it as a way of identifying a group that may be connected biologically. So it may be a kinship or a family group, but it may also be connected in different, more culturally specified ways. So genos on the one hand, and on the other, deimos, the sort of group that was fabricated in Athens by Cleisthenes in 508, before the Christian era, specifically as an alternative to genos. So democracy emerges when, or a significant step is taken in the emergence of democracy when Cleisthenes says, okay, it's not about the family or clan you belong to, it's about the deme, the district that you choose to be associated with. So I'll be thinking about these two strands in terms of the genos on the one hand and demos on the other. Now, genocide is one of these words that we have a very specific origin story for. It was invented by a Polish Jewish jurist, Raphael Lemkin, in 1943, first published in 1944. And then it became encoded in the UN Convention of 1948, which runs, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. And then it lists a series of acts that are counted as genocidal. And so as the details of the camps began to emerge, and as the pictures of those emaciated corpses began to invade our visual space, genocide became the word for whatever that was. That is to say, the worst, most awful thing. And so for a long time, that is the role that the word genocide has had, that it is the name we have for the most awful thing. And it came to be essential also that it be reserved for the most awful thing, the most dramatic of horrors, as though to do anything else would end up being a sort of disrespect for the victims of that particular horror. And this became enfolded into an ongoing controversy about the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Though we should remember that when Lemkin came up with the word genocide, what he had in mind was what was going on with the Jews of Europe at that moment, but also the Armenian genocide. He explicitly made the connection between those two. But the whole question of the uniqueness of the Holocaust required the reservation of the term genocide for something that would match that sort of horror. But there's another way in which genocide lies at the limits of our imagination. If this distancing effect was not already achieved by the foreignness of the scene where genocidal violence plays out, or the racial or ethnic otherness of the perpetrators and the victims, or the sheer physical distance between here and there, then its location, right at the limit of our ability to comprehend, would serve to set a distance between us and it. So this question about the uniqueness of genocidal violence, the exceptional nature of it, the extremity of its horror, we'll see by looking at the conversation that happened between 1943, when the word was invented, and 1948, when it became part of international agreements in the form of the convention. We see something different emerging there, and it is something that emerges in the self-understanding of Western democratic states, for whom genocide must be reserved as a kind of exotic horror. It could not be something that is a part of democratic existence. So a few words, so first section, a few words about the democratic paradox. Now, mostly, our genocide, as I've said, is made to appear to belong to another world, one beset by a sort of violence that our foreign intervention these days surely would have no hope of stopping, a violence so foreign that it could surely never erupt here. So, for example, for the democracies of Western Europe, the genocidal wars that destroyed Yugoslavia were often understood as spurred by a resurgence of old tribal thinking, genos against genos. In order to place the phenomenon of genocide in the past and far away, the Balkans would have to be remade as a marginal zone of Europe, not Europe, somewhere on the edge of Europe, and as a throwback to an old Europe of tribal difference and belligerent nationalism that had otherwise been replaced by a new Europe of federated commerce. Yet embedded in the horrified response was the knowledge that it really was not so long ago and not so far away. Democracy did not and does not make the genos irrelevant. It holds genos and demos in tension at its very core. And I want to identify this as the oldest version of the democratic paradox, going all the way back to Cleisthenes. And that's what the book that I finished there at the Humanities Institute, Democracy and Generational Being, is about. So most often then, democracy's paradoxes are traced to the modern confluence of democracy and liberalism, when sovereign power no longer resided in the person of the monarch and rule was no longer underwritten by a transcendent authority. Democracy placed the people in the place that was left empty by that disappearance. This is Claude Lefort's interpretation. The people became the only source of legitimate rule, and the prize offered by its self-rule was individual freedom. That's to say, collective rule is meant to deliver the freedom that will itself be a constant threat to collectivity. Put another way, self-rule requires sharing the work and responsibility of creating the rule to which all will be equally subject, even though we experience the very requirement that we be involved in the work of ruling as an infringement of the freedom that the rule promises. So this is one of the formulations of the way that democracy offers us something and takes it back at the same time. Indeed, in the face of clashing ideas of freedom, we might, as Rousseau warned, have to be forced to be free. And at the same time, though, it was Rousseau who also grasped that in order to rule, the people must be something other than a collection of individuals, and certainly something other than the collection of all individuals. Legitimate rule will not be achieved by people or the people, but by a people, Rousseau reminded us. And crucially, this people must be capable of self-rule isn't just found to occur, but must be created as a people capable of self-rule. So essential to this creation is a boundary or a criterion of belonging. And this produces another formulation of the democratic paradox. Carl Schmitt is famously associated with this, pointing to the distinction between them and us as the essential political distinction, and the inability of any liberal democracy to provide a liberal democratic criterion for belonging demonstrates the problem with the very form. For him, it was not a paradox, but just a straightforward contradiction. And so it doomed the project of liberal democracy to failure. And of course, for him, Carl Schmitt, it led famously to a theologized politics and a fascist affirmation of genos thinking. On the other hand, the contradiction could be quickly resolved by cosmopolitanism, what I would call cosmos thinking. If it is necessary to create peoples, in all cases, a people's political existence can be governed by universal or universalizable rules. Politically speaking, peoples are indistinguishable from people as such. So in principle, self-rule could be world rule, underwritten by universal law. And yet, the varieties of our experiences of belonging are not left behind when we become members of the demos. Rather than a logical contradiction, that is the death of democracy, as Carl Schmitt would have it, another line of political thought takes this on as a social paradox. It's the one that follows when social existence is acknowledged as being part of political life. Indeed, it's embraced as a life-giving paradox in this radical democratic tradition. Social identities rely on the existence of others against whom to demonstrate their distinctness, us and not them, in turn creating the political challenge of discovering a mechanism that can ensure that an identity will avoid the tendency to marginalize, exclude, and eliminate those same others. How will we prevent a single social identity from filling the abstract forms of universal citizenship with its own contingent content? This is how William Connolly puts it. The depth grammar of a political theory is shaped first by the way in which it either acknowledges or suppresses this paradox, and second, by whether it negotiates it pluralistically or translates it into an aggressive politics of exclusive universality. So let's leave that tradition of radical democratic thinking about the democratic politics suspended in midair for a moment. And let me say some things about how the concept of genocide evolved. I'll be looking in particular at some things that happened between 1943 and 1948 that emerged in the diplomatic negotiations leading up to the convention. So if we approach democracy then through our judgment of genocide, this leads us below and behind William Connolly's insight to the paradoxical relationship of demos and genus or genos. Its contours begin to emerge as soon as the world took up Lemkin's term after 43 and began to use it to describe that terrible horror that was before us. In 1946, the states of the world, in near unanimity, condemned genocide as, quote, shocking to the conscience of mankind, close quote. But then what exactly was the object of this shock? What was the word going to mean? Unanimity, of course, became a task. And for 2 years, diplomats and scholars, including Lemkin, negotiated which acts were so particularly shocking and what about them was unconscionable. The universal desire to condemn was constantly jostled by particular desires to avoid self-recrimination or self-incrimination on particular grounds, which became obvious in the campaign by the Soviet Union and its allies to remove reference to political groups. That's well known, but there is a lesser known campaign that was led by Western democracies to remove various considerations under the heading of cultural genocide. So the initial resolution stated that crimes of genocide had occurred when racial, religious, political, and other groups are destroyed entirely or in part. In the first full draft of the convention, known as the Secretariat draft, the list had changed, and the purpose of the convention was described as preventing, quote, the destruction of racial, national, linguistic, religious, or political groups of human beings. So we see shifts in emphasis happening very early on. Following the Soviet Union's argument and the eventual acquiescence on the part of the United States, the final version drops mentions of political groups, listing only national, ethnical, racial, and religious groups. The Secretariat draft went on to elaborate 3 forms of genocide: physical genocide, which included massacres, but also the deprivation of the means of livelihood that produces a slow death; biological genocide, which is perpetrated by restricting births, for example; and the third one, cultural genocide, which destroys the specific characteristics of a group by forced transfer of children, exile, repression of language, or the destruction of books and religious artifacts. With the exception of the transfer of children, which was shifted over into the notion of biological genocide, all elements of cultural genocide disappeared from the final draft. So those who objected acknowledged the genocidal horrors of the camps, and they wanted to preserve that term for those specific acts, rejecting a continuum that would lead from there to the harm of cultural destruction. So the Danish delegate, for instance, argued that, quote, it would show a lack of logic and of a sense of proportion to include in the same convention both mass murders in gas chambers and the closing of libraries. But of course, we have to ask, what logic did that delegate have in mind? The United States declared in the same context, the prohibition of the use of a language, the systematic destruction of books, and destruction and dispersion of documents and objects of historical or artistic value, commonly known in this convention to those who wish to include it as cultural genocide, is a matter which certainly should not be included in this convention. The act of creating the new international crime of genocide is one of extreme gravity, and the United States feels that it should be confined to those barbarous acts directed against individuals, which form the basic concept of public opinion on this subject. So there's an appeal to a logic which goes unspecified, except here by the United States, a logic determined by a basic concept of public opinion on the subject of genocide. So it's not quite clear, however, who this public is, what public is referred to here. For others in the international discussion relied on other concepts. Pakistan, for instance, this was 1946. So Pakistan took the position that, quote, cultural genocide represented the end, whereas physical genocide was merely the means. For millions of men in most Eastern countries, Pakistan continued, the protection of sacred books and shrines was more important than life itself. The destruction of those sacred books or shrines might mean the extinction of spiritual life. China held that quote, cultural genocide might be even more harmful than physical or biological genocide, since it worked below the surface and attacked a whole population, attempting to deprive it of its ancestral culture and destroy its very language, close quote. It's remarkable to think how the world was going to change within a year or two of this. Within a year, partition would have happened in the Indian subcontinent, and within 2 years, we would have seen the rise of Mao Zedong in China. It was broadly and casually accepted in the course of these conversations in the 1940s that cultures could be ranked and that they ranged from primitive to advanced, and that backward cultures were subject to a logic of civilization. So the Union of South Africa, quote, wished to point to the danger latent in the provisions on cultural genocide where primitive or backward groups were concerned, close quote. Specifically, certain cultures would necessarily come to the civilizing action of the state. Iran, for its part, was concerned that it would, quote, have to be decided whether all cultures, even the most barbarous, deserve protection, and whether the assimilation resulting from the civilizing actions of a state also constituted genocide. This is crucial. Assimilation. Is assimilation going to count as cultural genocide? Others used the same premises. Australia's delegate, apparently speaking without irony, said that, quote, genocide was such a vile act that even savages and wild beasts were incapable of committing it. War-toughened soldiers had been struck with horror at the sight of the victims of genocide who were still alive, close quote. Sweden pointedly expressed the anxiety that was running through the minds of these representatives, delegates from democratic countries. Quote, this is Sweden now. The question could arise whether, for example, the fact that Sweden had converted the Lapps to Christianity might not lay her open to the accusation that she had committed an act of cultural genocide, close quote. The modern state clearly had a need, even a duty, to establish a degree of homogeneity in its population in order to make of it a people. The continuum that had to be blocked was the one that led from the horrors of the camps to the horrors of what Western democracies regarded as a normal part of state building. Now, democracy asserts the priority of demos over genos in political life. Here, the assertion is indistinguishable from the assertion of one hegemonic genos over others in the name of democratic assimilation. The Canadian delegate's statement enacts that collapse. So, quote, the government and people of Canada are horrified at the idea of cultural genocide and hoped that effective action would be taken to suppress it. The people of his country, this is Canada, were deeply attached to their cultural heritage, which was made up mainly, listen to this, which is made up mainly of a combination of Anglo-Saxon and French elements. And they would strongly oppose the attempt to undermine the influence of those two cultures, as they would oppose any similar attempt in any other part of the world, close quote. So the cultures that needed to be protected in Canada were English and French. So no reference is made to Canada's violence against native peoples. The delegate notes instead that, quote, he knew of no country where the government and the people generally were more concerned to ensure the preservation of the culture, language, and religion of minority groups, close quote. As it happened, all mention of cultural genocide was deleted from the final draft. The countries that had led this campaign were the United States, France, and Canada. In identifying genocide as a distinctive evil, perhaps the very worst evil that there is, we reinforce our commitment to the genos and reinforce one of the conditions that goes on to produce genocidal violence. This is what I have been calling the genocidal paradox, the genocide paradox. If the genos were the only way that we knew how to organize ourselves, there might be genocides and genocidal violence, but there wouldn't be anything paradoxical about it. Our identification of the particular wrongness of genocide is possible only from the point of view of another way of being, one that distinguishes itself from the model of the genus, but continues to value it like nothing else? How is it that democracy, the way of being that opens up a place of contestation and puts the demos at its center, has not found a way to make the genus irrelevant, or worked out a relation to violence that ends attacks by genus on genus, or by the demos on genos? What is it about democracy that allows us to identify genocide as a distinctively bad thing, and at the same time not only fail to prevent it, but indeed to pursue it in the name of assimilation as demos building? It may be that we're never going to be able to give up our commitment to the genos and to generation, nor live political life in anything other than generational terms. Excuse me. In the first place, however, the task is to bring that commitment to light. And this is made more, I think, rather than less difficult by a consensus around genocide. We all agree about its horror. Even perpetrators lament having to do such terrible work. So an explanation of how and why it is wrong seems superfluous. But if we insist, we quickly come upon the love of genos as the natural and universal phenomenon that is violated by genocidal violence. The mistake, I think, though, is in failing to consider the process of naturalization and universalization that make the genos the obvious answer, and failing to interrogate the values that are wronged in genocide. So these are the two strands that I wanted to set in place: the democratic paradox and the evolution in the thinking of genocide. But now, what about the phenomenon of we charge genocide, which emerged in the United States as early as 1951, so barely 3 years after the Genocide Convention? This was long before the United States ratified the Genocide Convention, however. It wasn't ratified until 1986. And there will be another question to be asked about why it took that long. Though I think the short answer is simply United States exceptionalism. So we charge genocide. This is the final section. So we've seen how the distinctions in the Secretariat draft between physical, biological and cultural genocide, and how they, we have seen those three distinctions and how they became preoccupations for the negotiators. But in 1951, the Civil Rights Congress, the CRC, presented a petition to the United Nations entitled "We Charge Genocide." The CRC was a United States organization. It had accumulated evidence and argumentation for the claim that anti-Black violence in the United States constituted genocide under the convention. Lynching, racially motivated assaults and bombings, police violence, imprisonment, and state execution, as well as more structural forms of violence such as poverty, segregation, lack of access to adequate education and medical treatment, and the denial of the right to vote. The petition argued that Black Americans were exposed to genocidal violence, quote, as a result of the consistent, conscious, unified policies of every branch of the US government, close quote. These charges were not presented as mere words, but as, quote, facts felt on our bodies, crimes inflicted on our dignity, close quote. This brings surging to the surface what the US, France, and Canada and their allies had wished to suppress by their resistance to the heading of cultural genocide. They resisted any description that would suggest a continuum between the camps and residential schooling for Indigenous children, or prison plantations occupied or filled with Black prisoners, or indeed the closing of libraries. Yet what had been suppressed was something, I think, beyond the threefold definition of physical, biological, and cultural genocide. Implicit in all of this was the thought of structural genocide. In the collected volume, in the essays, Logics of Genocide, which Shirley showed on the screen earlier, an abiding theme is moving from thought of genocide as a set of events and towards the notion of the genocidal, which includes the notion that genocide is something that can be built into the structures of our society. So structural genocide and the genocidal. So a set of policies or practices may not intend the destruction of a group, though note that the CRC did point to intention as being a factor in the setup of the racist institutions of the United States. So certain policies or practice might not intend the destruction of a group, but they may nonetheless tend towards the production of that effect. They may not kill off the group, but they may have a drastic impact on the life chances of the individuals of the group, or indeed the group itself as a collection of people. They may not mete out physical death, but they may create the conditions for the social death that is the loss of vitality for entire communities. In his 2007 paper, Structural Violence as a Form of Genocide, Nafiz Mossadegh Ahmed identifies 4 key figures of structural genocide, the final one being the target groups became targets primarily because they were categorized by the perpetrating regime as ultimately disposable. That is, irrelevant to the pursuit of other interests or goals that were elevated to a more significant level. In this respect, relative to those interests or goals, they were fundamentally dehumanized or otherwise. As Lisa Gunther has pointed out in her writing on this, quote, by definition, the pattern of violence articulated in We Charge Genocide would clearly constitute an example of structural genocide, close quote. The CRC in 1951 declares that the end of genocide means peace and defines peace in terms of democratic self-determination. So here's a quote from the CRC. We Charge Genocide. Quote, the end of genocide against the Negro people of the United States will mean returning this country to its people. It will mean a new growth of popular democracy and the forces of peace. It will mean an end to the threat of atomic war. It will mean peace for the world and for all mankind. This is where I'll end. It is an inspired hope for democracy. But when the very interests and goals that are elevated to a more significant level, so this is drawing on Ahmed's definition of structural genocide, when the very interests and goals that are elevated to a more significant level are presented as the goals of democracy, for example, unity and shared freedoms, a way of belonging that claims not to be determined by the structures of genus or genos, and indeed asks us to suspend or erase the distinctions that shape us in the name of a formal democratic equality that requires those it has created as other to assimilate to its demos. Then the structures of democracy harbor the very structures of genocidal violence.
Okay, wow. I believe that Shirley is going to moderate the questions. And I don't know, Shirley, if you're starting off with a question of your own.
Yes, I'm happy to moderate the questions. I think I'm still personally reverberating with everything that Anne has discussed so complexly yet beautifully, and especially, right now I'm, sort of the whole idea of structural genocide is washing over me as, oh, whoops, could start my video. There we go. Structural genocide, oopsies, is kind of washing over me, both from the U.S. context, being a U.S. historian, thinking about the implications for indigenous peoples and slavery. I think many of us were probably thinking of Orlando Patterson's title, Slavery and Social Death, right, when Anne was invoking genocide. And then, of course, there's, as most of you know, my own personal family history of mass murder and genocide in Indonesia. So I think at this moment, I'm still somewhat on the, still trying to even, my voice isn't quite there yet to articulate a question, but I'm delighted if somebody else is is. And so please raise your hand and I will do my best to unmute you.
Okay. So, Andrew.
Yeah. So I was curious kind of to what degree you would say this analysis is sort of tied to a, not to be too Marxisty about it, but kind of a liberal bourgeois conception of both the individual and the nation, because I can sort of see echoes of it also in you know, ancient democratic discourse, right? I mean, like the Athenians think of themselves as autochthonous, right, coming out of the ground, and that's why they're, you know, they're demos that can rule themselves. But then, you know, conversely, like the Romans are like, oh no, you know, you can be a murderer, that's fine. Are you like a cattle thief? Cool, like come join our republic, that's fine. So I was curious if you think this kind of has a more transhistorical variance, or if this is kind of, it requires a certain set of conceptions of like what a political subject is, and you know, if they have rights, and how they form a nation based out of like their individualities, and you know, kind of liberal nationalism and these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's certainly something that I see happening at the crux of what it means to make a demos. So I don't think it is constrained to the phenomenon of liberal democracy and the notion that one is constituted first as a subject, and then we all get together and we form a people and then become a democracy. But in the sense it allows space for different ways of becoming the group that becomes a democracy. So that's why I make reference to Rousseau early on and his insight that it's not a set of individuals, but it is rather, he will call it a people. A people becomes a democracy, or a people becomes the subjects, as it were, of self-rule. But what I'm trying to pick up on in the radical democracy tradition is, and Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, but mostly Mouffe is the person I have in mind here, that her response to Schmitt, who says, you know, liberalism, democracy, they just cancel one another out, it's not going to work. Her response is, yeah, they struggle against one another, but that is what keeps democracy in check on one level. And it's what makes democracy a task. That is to say, it's something that requires constant engagement. So the formation of a people and the ways of thinking about what it is to be a people and the question of political subjectivity is something that has to be constantly renegotiated.
Oh, I see that Nerissa has dropped a question into the chat. So Nerissa, I'm trying to unmute you right now. And if you could actually read your question out loud, it's wonderful.
Thanks. I was in the last HIS, the last event of the Humanities Institute, and I didn't know how to unmute myself, and I was screaming at Edwidge Danticat, so I didn't want to do that again. You know, Susan will remember, so embarrassing. Anyway, and I know of Schmitt as a theorist of fascism, and I only think of him as that. And could I ask you to just sort of go back again? Like, did I get that right, that Schmitt said that liberal democracy was doomed and would actually eventually collapse to fascism? And thank you for your beautiful presentation.
Thanks so much. I don't know that he necessarily articulated it in evolutionary terms or in terms of a historical necessity, but he rather diagnosed the theory of liberal democracy as something that's inherently contradictory, because it offers freedom on the one hand and equality on the other, and that while it nurtures one, it infringes on the other. So there's always going to be this struggle. And what the radical democratic theorists are saying is, yes, it's a struggle, it's a tension, it's a problem, But what Schmidt was saying is that it is simply contradictory. And so it means that that hopes for a flourishing, thriving liberal democracy are doomed, that it's just never going to work, which is one of the ways that he accounts for fascism as being the preferred option.
Okay, thank you. I don't see a name on the screen, but TV7RS, I feel that you wanted to say something, and so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. This always takes a second to register. Here, I'm still trying to unmute you. Okay, come on. Come on, Zoom, help. Okay, I'm still clicking the unmute button. There we go, finally.
Yeah, no, it's, I have that strange anonym under my name because I've never officially changed this. So when I come into a program like this, I end up having this completely absurd set of letters and numbers. But wonderful talk, and really, really remarkable. In every sense, bringing together things we care about in fresh and bold ways. I just have a somewhat technical question about the range of the term genos for you. Clearly, it can include both racial origins, but also, of course, family connections, genealogical, literally genealogical.
Yes.
And how do you sort out these two classes and doubtless others in your analysis of genocide? Because clearly race has been the most oppressive and the most horrific, but still these things are all they're all entwined, because racial identities are passed on through families, and families reinforce the racial identities of their members across generations. So I guess it's really almost a semantic question about this and how you sort this out. Or do you just say, well, genocide is really, the genos is really about racial identity and doesn't have this larger connotation, which seems to me it does bear in many, many words that contain the gen prefix. So it's just more a question of clarifying your own use of the term, and then maybe implications for your own view of genocide overall. Yeah.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you so much, and thanks for being here. I have an entire chapter on kinship, and the short, well, one of the most pointed examples of this problem I encountered recently in a radio review of a book written by a family memoir written by a man from Louisiana. And in his family, not too many generations ago, was a white supremacist leader, and who had left family documents and family lore. And the theme that kept recurring in the racist activities of this grandfather or great-grandfather was that he was protecting his family, that it was going to be essential to him to fight off those racial others in order to protect his family, the purity of his family, the privilege of his family, and the two were completely intertwined.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example of what you're saying, but of course, not the only one by far. And I think this is what made me attracted to the use of genos, because it captured both those things and showed us the tension that's in operation there. The thing that is most significant about genos for me is the relation to time, because a genos, another way that I have of describing it defining it in the book, is that it is a group that is the embodiment of its own temporal principle. So a genus is above all an intergenerational group. It is, by belonging to a genos, we are descended from something, and are connected already to the future. It's a way of being hooked into a past, belonging to a past and a future. And so it's completely bound up with the questions of where it is that we belong and the moment at which that becomes racialized. The discussion is really fascinating from watching Skip Gates's show on television, Finding Your Roots, and the forms of evidence that are offered there. There's family lore, there's the historical archive, and then there's DNA. And DNA is presented as having a certain sort of authority that is immensely meaningful for people for whom the historical archive gives out at a very particular point. For African Americans, it's often 1871. Like before that census, there's just no record. And so DNA gives something really intriguing and moving and significant for people. But what is that? I mean, what is DNA going to tell us? So the work, the chapter on kinship in the work is the one that tries to unravel some of those complications and to account for some of the affect that's involved in the experience of belonging that gets translated from a family connectedness into a racial connectedness.
So belonging is really a key here, right?
Yeah.
That's very interesting. So a certain, which would involve dimensions of domesticity, co-inhabitation, proximity, right?
Yes. Yeah.
All of that gets very complicated, but very interesting because of course culture does begin to invade. You can't keep kinship and race apart from culture, but nevertheless, your analysis, because you start with demos/genos, it leads us to wonder, what is the exact scope of genos? And that's very helpful, what you've just told us. Let me ponder that, Anne. Thanks so much. Really, that's terrific. Yeah.
I want to follow up on that, on Ed's really provocative explication of these terms, because as I was listening, I also kept thinking that genos isn't so much versus demos. I mean, in understand, because especially when genos is expanded to include race, race is a cultural construct, a social construct. It is something, we now know that you can't tie even to DNA in a very precise way. It's shifting, and what constitutes a race is something that's culturally constructed or chosen at times. And so there is a kind of act of making a genos, just as we make a demos. So can you talk a little bit about how you can still use these terms in an era when the fluidity and shifting nature of those two has become so apparent to us?
Right, that's a lovely way of putting it, because I think it sharpens the tensions in a really useful way. That the thing about genos is that it is invariably presented or read as a natural phenomenon, that it gets naturalized immediately. And so there's a way in which the first thing that we have to do is to take it out of that realm of unquestionability, that we have to subject it to interrogation and make it, like, sort of open it up to question, in the way that demos is already a question for itself, because it doesn't, and principally I think, and because it doesn't have this principle of self-perpetuation built into it. It doesn't have a natural way of perpetuating itself. So this is the relationship, or the tension at that point becomes the tendency of demos to take on that naturalized genetic structure in order to describe itself. And then the danger consequent on that is of the demos collapsing into a naturalized genus. Yeah. And that's where the force of assimilation takes shape as well. So that's the thing that I do need to emphasize, though. Thank you for pointing that out, that that the genus is itself something that we have to denaturalize.
Yeah, and you're right about the intense effort to naturalize the demos. I mean, with you know, the naturalization, even as a term of when we make you a part of the demos, you are naturalized. And the same plotting of the nation in terms of the temporality. I mean, Benedict Anderson, of course, made that argument most memorably, that the creation of a nation requires a temporal plotting where it reaches to an immemorial past and an endless future. So the kind of temporality you mapped onto genos is precisely the move that demos takes to naturalize and give itself a similar kind of power. So the two definitely are in conversation with each other.
Yes, yeah, and I think it goes back to Andrew's point at the beginning. Like the Greeks, they loved, or the Athenians loved calling themselves, you know, of all the others, we are the autochthonous ones. We've been here all along. We have never migrated, so we don't have to ask ourselves those questions.
Which is, of course, absurd. They clearly had crap loads of people who migrated into the Attic Peninsula, but they didn't want to believe that.
No. Charlie has his hand up.
Yes, I need to unmute everything takes like weirdly longer because I need to unmute myself and then I need to call on Charles and then unmute Charles. So I'm trying to unmute you, Charles. I'm hitting the button. Whoopsies, that worked and then I hit it too many times. Let me try again. There we go.
There you go.
How about that? Okay, so I guess I want to ask now about the demos instead of the genos. So my question is, so going back to that moment when Cleisthenes kind of instituted the demos and he like divided Athens, right? Divided it up geographically. And so I guess my question is about, I was thinking about situations today like occupations.
Oh, yeah.
Illegal immigration, where it seems to even have a claim of genocide. You have to at least belong geographically to a place. You have to be at least part of the demos, if not. So I guess I'm wondering, how would you describe like an occupation? Would that fall under the category of a genocide, or does that, is the demos a necessarily spatial like category? Do you have to be in a place, to be a certain place to be in the demos? Or then I guess there's also the notion of like a cosmopolitan, you know, there's no limits at that point. You're kind of a member of this, of the cosmos.
Don't unmute yourself yet, because I'm not quite understanding where you're coming from yet. So there's that Cleisthenes moment where, you know, it was a point in Athens where the clans, the aristocratic families were just fighting with one another. And interestingly, Cleisthenes makes reference to a sort of an incredibly intense examination of the roles. It kept, you know, consulting the roles of the city to see whose parents were born where and who gets to be included as an Athenian. And so the notion of shifting away from that and to the demes was to sort of put an end to that. Let's say anyone who has any sort of claim to be a citizen, let's just go with it. And now you pick your deme and we'll take it from there.
Right.
So there's that space, that very distinct spatial element to it.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, what happens when that very process is called into question? Like in an occupation, I'm thinking really about the Israel-Palestine occupation, where there's competing demoses. You know, there's like, which state are we in? So how would that, you're thinking about genocide, how would that map onto a situation where the very political sovereignty of two peoples is at stake over the same land?
Right. Yeah. I think I get you now. which goes back to the problem of the nation state. I mean, the nation state is still with us. I mean, it was invented in the 19th century, and everybody got on board with it. But everything that we think about democracy in term, or the demos, as the people who rule by virtue of coming together as a demos, and not by virtue of anything else. So there isn't a racial or an identity entry card there. The only one being here. So that's the territorial element of it. So by virtue of being here, we are going to figure out how to rule ourselves. But then in the example that you mentioned, this is at the kernel of the whole notion of a two-state or a one-state solution. Like, if we're committed to or if we're stuck with the form of the nation state, then the two-state solution is the only option. But if we're thinking about democracy and taking seriously the possibility that we can enter the demos from various places, from out of or as various identities, then the only right solution is a single state solution. So that talked around your question, but have we got to the question itself yet?
I think you did, because then it would be a question of remaking the demos to encompass multiple heterogeneous genuses. Yeah,
and that's really hard. I mean, that's, I think, what was bothering all those delegates in those negotiations in the 1940s. You know, we all belong to nation states, because that's, you know, the United Nations. And all of us, the states that we represent, have done these various things to produce to what degree we couldn't discuss, but to some degree a homogeneous group that we can identify with. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, how much violence are we allowed to do in that process?
It makes me think of Renan, of course, in What is the Nation? That it is the necessity to have forgotten the violence.
Indeed. Oh, exactly.
The nation is formed. And I love the form, to have already. So it has to be already. You cannot think the nation without an act of forgetting the necessary violence. It's, yeah, those words, they keep coming back to me. Oh, wow. Wow. Other questions, comments?
I'd like to hear more. I'd like to hear more from Shirley about the work that she's been doing. But I'd also like to hear more about any thoughts that people have about what's happening right here, right now, in the sense of the way in which violence is distributed in our society, and how helpful or not you think it might be to think about that or to talk about that in terms of genocide.
There is a hand up from
yes, from He-Chen, yes, who's been unmuted.
Hi, Professor Auburn. I really like your talk.
Thank you.
So there's one question about the structural genocide. So you kind of related the African American experience with the structural genocide, right? So I was wondering, what's the distinction between structural genocide and structural oppression? Like, because we could argue that historically the disabled, whether it's mentally disabled or physically disabled, and the LGBTQ group, people with different sexual orientation, are also systematically oppressed. So I was wondering, how do we actually make distinction of these cases, or do we say that's an act of genocide?
This is a really interesting question, and there've been various philosophical attempts to think through genocide in terms of defining what sort of groups are susceptible to it or not. So how are we going to pin down what sort of actions count as genocidal actions, and what sort of groups are susceptible to genocide? And that always ends up saying, well, if you're a religious group, yeah, probably. If you're an LGBT group, no, that doesn't count. And then you very quickly find yourself asking, like, what the point of this conversation is at all. There are some who argue, and Jackie Stevens does this in the Logics of Genocide volume. She says, why are we talking about genocide at all? There's violence out there in the world, and it's violence that we have to set our faces against. That's the question that we should be working on. And I hear you saying something similar. Why aren't we just talking about oppression? What's so special? What's so special about genocide? Which is also why I found myself writing a chapter in the book saying, what's wrong with genocide? I mean, why do we make a special case for this? And so I think there's a historical explanation for it in terms of the specific horrors of the 1940s. But then something else happened, and I gestured towards it, that because it came to name a very particular sort of spectacle of horror, it came to be regarded as the thing that we can't imagine anything worse than this. So there's violence, which is a bad thing to have happen. You know, there's people putting you out of your house, and there's people attacking you, and there's sexual violence, and these are all bad things. But if they're done in a genocidal context, that makes it even worse. You know, it adds insult to injury. And there seems to be a way in which that it forms a distraction, that we get concerned and worried about anything that has the name genocide attached to it, whereas we should be just as worried about other forms of violence. But the question that I want to ask is why we keep doing that. In the sense that why is it that we want to regard genocidal violence as being qualitatively different and qualitatively more horrifying? And the reason I keep asking that question is because I think it sends us back to things that we value, but they are so deeply naturalized that we don't know that we set such store by them. And that's the notion of generational being and the sort of belonging that I kept bumping into, the notion that we were introduced into the world by somebody, and that it's a world that we will pass on to others after our time. So that generational structure is something that's deeply important to us. And so it seems to require of us that we regard violence that attacks that structure as being particularly bad.
Yeah. No, Hee-Chen, your question was perfect, and it was very helpful to hear you talk through it, because you want me to discuss my own research on mass murder and genocide in Indonesia, and I'm grappling with some of these thorny issues myself, because as many of you, but not all of you know, the reason why I'm in the United States and I'm an American is because of the mass murders / genocide in Indonesia in 1965. That was one of the most marked series of mass murders. The US was very much part and parcel of it in the Cold War against communism. So in the Indonesian case, many scholars are actually reluctant to call it genocide because it was the murder of communists, in particular the PKI, the largest communist party outside of the Soviet Union and China. However, more recent scholarship has pointed out that communists, but in certain parts of Indonesia, the Chinese, who are very closely associated with the Communist Party, were targets of the mass murders, hence genocide. And, so it's become a real sort of debate between scholars. And it's because of, what becomes at stake if you label things. Because, on the one hand, I also feel that, forms of violence, sexual violence, violence comes in so many different forms that they are all important. But it's the scale of having, 500,000 to 1 million people killed within a matter of months, killed very brutally, macheted, beaten, dumped into rivers, so much that, in the space of a few weeks, 5% of Bali's population was killed, that I think, as Anne has so carefully delineated, it gives us this sense that there's somehow a way that you can quantify or qualify what's happening by the sheer scale of it. So, so that for me, that's one part of the picture. But, I'm a cultural historian, and what also, is something that I think about is the way that, say, just to give one example, that my family's last name, Lim, has been eradicated in Indonesia. All of my family members who remain in Indonesia right now have quote unquote Indonesian last names. And that's true of everybody. Any celebration, say, of Chinese New Year or anything to do with cultural heritage. And let me also add that my family has been in Indonesia for, at least 6 or 7 generations and has very heavily intermarried. But these are ways of, we don't speak any Chinese languages, but we have the name, and there's certain, customs and cultural celebrations that remain. But, my family is very culturally Indonesian, except for things like name and, say, celebrating Chinese New Year. But to have these all banned and sort of, having the cultural genocide also occur in Indonesia is something that I also find, very interesting to think through and trace. So, there's a lot that, especially in the case of Indonesia, that is not necessarily set in stone, but that people are trying to work through and debate, because, 1965 is something that's not even acknowledged in Indonesia or the United States, right? So it's something that's just sort of emerging in the scholarship and in the political discourse.
It's interesting to see that conjunction of a political group that then is collapsed into a racial group, because this is what happened in Germany also, that they that communist and Jewish became synonymous.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Andrew, is that a hand, or is that a stretch?
No, it's a hand. No, it's interesting because you could plausibly argue that the Communist Party, the PKI was creating kind of a demos, and it wasn't just limited to the PKI, right? So the CIA and various right reactionaries called this the Jakarta method, right? And this was a global right-wing movement to basically kill communists in great numbers on every continent of the planet, and to do so in such a thorough way that it essentially killed a way of life. So I think you could say it was genocidal in the sense that, in the post World War II period, you had this kind of mass, especially in the post-colonial world, kind of demoification of peoples as sort of communists and socialists, built around a certain kind of set of shared beliefs, customs, practices, rituals, and then they were all killed in like 10 years, systematically obliterated.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you who don't know the work, Andrew was referencing Vincent Bevan's recent Jakarta method, which, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times, I think in May or June, and the book was just released, but it shows how the Jakarta method, which was refers to the mass murders of the PKI, was actually spread throughout, the post-colonial world, especially in places like Brazil, Chile. But really, I mean, it was it was literally called that and known as such in these countries. So it really is interesting how, interesting is not even, it's sort of beyond words, right, to sort of say what this phenomenon was, but how these mass murders were actually perpetuated, you know, as Andrew says, throughout the post-colonial world.
Mm-hmm.
We are almost at the end of our time, so if anyone has one more question, I keep wanting to ask, but it's an impossible question of whether you can envision shaping democracy in a different way. Because the current way, I mean, the history that you've brilliantly traced out, the oppositions, it seems that it's caught us in this moment. So having thought as long as you have, again, this is just like, I really would hope for something, if not hopeful,
Yes.
maybe in process before leaving this really profoundly thought-provoking but disturbing conversation.
Well, I think at the very least, and this isn't a new thought at all, is to acknowledge that we come into the demos in various ways and in various forms, because there's the whole conversation about the fate of America, of constitutional America. And okay, it got off to a bad start, but you know, Civil War kind of helped straighten things out a bit. Eventually, women were included too. We had to have the civil rights movement. You know, that got it expanded a bit more. And if we just keep working on it, if we just sort of keep expanding it a bit, we'll get everybody in eventually. We're moving towards, you know, a more perfect union all the time. The question that we have to keep asking, though, is what price we're expected to pay to belong to that union. I mean, what is it of ourselves that we are asked to leave behind in order to belong to the American people, the American demos? And some people are asked to shed more of themselves than others, which is to say, views of the world and ways of living and well, ways of occupying that generational space are different among people. And I think the demos has to figure out a way of not treating us as if we can leave all of those at the edge of the public sphere, as if we can all become interchangeable in a way, that we become members of the demos as these figures rather than as fully fledged, socially developed, culturally different human beings. So that, I think any solution is going to have to start off from there, and to take seriously the fact that if you emerge into the demos from a position of having been discriminated against, or having had your rights ignored, or having had your voice unheard, then you're going to occupy the public space in a different way.
Well, thank you, Anne, for just an amazing talk. I mean, so provocative, so clear. It was really wonderful. I appreciate it tremendously.
I'm really grateful for you showing up. I seriously, you know, who needs another Zoom meeting? I wish we were,
this Zoom meeting everybody needs, whether they know it or not.
I wish we could just like move into the little room to one side and have some wine and cheese and go to dinner afterwards. And
I really miss that.
That would be really nice. But perhaps someday.
Well,
I miss cutting up the cheese.
Get together again. We are going to have such a party.
I tell you. So really, thank you all very much. And for this feedback, it's, you know yourself, you go off into your room and you go like this for months, if not years on end. And then, you know, you offer this thing to a group of colleagues, and it's wonderful to get this feedback and have these questions.
This is really wonderful, and I look forward to reading the book. And okay, thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you so much.